Fairy and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to go through the basics of shutter speed. I'm going to explain the difference between fast and slow speeds, and I'm also going to give you all the information that you need to be able to start taking more dramatic photographs, enabling you to freeze action and also blur motion. Shutter speed controls movement within your photograph. But before we get onto the technicalities of how to manipulate this, first of all let me explain what the shutter actually is. So the shutter is situated inside of the camera, and it's a timer of the light entering. If you think of it like a door that remains closed, as soon as you fire the camera, you're opening that door, allowing light to enter and reach the sensor. You have control over how long that door remains open. One thing you do need to be aware of is the exposure triangle. So we're focusing on shutter speed today, but there are two other elements to this triangle, and that's aperture and ISO. I have done other videos on these, so please check them out. I'll put the links in the description below. All you need to know for now is that all these three things work together. So shutter speeds are measured in seconds, but more commonly in fractions of a second. The bigger the denominator, the faster the speed. Here are some typical shutter speed settings. Those at the top were settings shown as an 8,000th of a second or 4,000th of a second, and much faster than those lower down the list of, say for example, an 1/8 of a second. And towards the bottom you've got the very slow speeds, such as 15 seconds or 30 seconds. Most modern cameras these days will go as quick as 8,000th of a second and as long as 30 seconds. Some can be quicker still, and also you do have the bulb setting on your camera, which can be as long as you hold the shutter down for. So shutter speed is like ISO or aperture, it's moved in stops. And this works on the basis of doubles or halves. So what I mean by this is if you're going from 125th of a second to 250th of a second, you're halving the amount of light entering the camera. But if you're moving from 1,000th of a second to 500th of a second, then you're doubling the amount of light entering the camera. So now we know what shutter speed is, what can we do with it? So let's look at slow shutter speeds first. So this is where your shutter or door is open a lot longer. So the first thing to bear in mind is when you have a slow shutter speed, objects can appear blurry. But more importantly, if you're hand holding your camera, the whole picture can end up blurry. So what I recommend you do is always have your camera on a tripod. The general rule is that if you're shooting any slower than a 60th of a second, you should always use a tripod. A lot of lenses these days do have something called image stabilization on them, which sometimes allows you to have it a bit slower than you would normally. Don't forget to turn that off though when you're using a tripod, because the mechanism to stabilize that image can actually cause a bit of blur itself. Secondly, because you've got a longer shutter speed, the shutter is allowing a lot more light into the camera, which means that your photograph is going to end up being a lot brighter than you expect it to be. But using blur in photographs can be really nice. You've probably heard of the fairy water effect, so go and practice with some water. It's a really good opportunity to be able to get some nice motion blur in there. Here I shot with a shutter speed of 0.4 of a second. Using these speeds also will give you the classic waterfall shots where you want to smooth out the water to get that creative look. Here I used a speed of 2.5 seconds to soften the water, make it look a lot calmer because the wind was blowing that day and causing the water to look quite choppy. For longer exposures like these, low light, dusk or night is an easier time to avoid the image being overexposed, as more light is entering the camera, although you can use a neutral density filter to reduce the amount of light entering the camera. You can use motion blur in other ways too, and that's to help tell a story or demonstrate movement that might not always be obvious. Look at this first image of some Tibetan spinning wheels. This was taken with a fairly quick shutter speed and it has frozen the wheels, making them look static. But now look what happens if you slow the shutter speed down. You can see the moving wheels on the right of the image have caught the motion, demonstrating they are wheels that spin rather than static objects. Now in order to freeze fast action, you have to increase the shutter speed. Birds are a great example of when you'd have to use a fast speed. To get this gull sharp I used a speed of 2,000th of a second. And to ensure the bird in this photo was sharp, I had to increase further to 3,200th of a second. These polar bears were mock fighting, and I couldn't set up a tripod, so I was hand holding the camera. I used a fast shutter speed of 800th of a second to capture them without any blur. And these walrus were being very inquisitive, popping up out of the water to look into the boat which I was in. So this required an even faster shutter speed of 1,250th of a second. But it's not just nature that requires fast shutter speeds. Sporting events are another example of when to use them. I used a speed here of 320th of a second to capture the player in the air. But for the Queen's Guards, who were not moving as fast as the rugby players, a moderate speed of only 100th of a second was used. Now, knowing which shutter speed to use is a bit of trial and error. There's no hard and fast rules, but it does depend on your subject and how fast they are moving. One thing you have to bear in mind is don't always shoot with a really fast shutter speed, because this does have an impact on your aperture and your exposure. And you do need really good light to have fast shutter speeds. But sometimes in certain situations, it's really good to have a bit of blur in your photographs. Now, if your lighting stays the same, you do have to compensate for changes in shutter speed by changing either your ISO or your aperture. Now, let me show you how to get off your auto mode and start creating these effects for yourself. Now, I recommend you going into shutter speed priority mode on your camera. The reason for this is that the camera will choose the best aperture for you, so you don't have to worry about it. And don't forget your ISO. Go ahead and put that on auto as well for now. Allocate your mode dial here. It may be situated in a different place, or it may be under your camera's main settings. Your dial may also have a mode dial lock release button you have to press down in order to turn it. Now go ahead and rotate it to TV, which stands for time value. You'll typically see this on a Canon or Pentax, but the camera may also allocate an S, which you'll generally find on a Nikon or Sony. Now you're in shutter speed priority mode, all that's left is how to change it. The easiest way is using the main dial on the top of your camera. Turn this along to the desired speed. It's also worth mentioning here that on most cameras, shutter speed will not show up directly as a fraction of a second. It will typically be a regular number. When the shutter speed is longer than or equal to 1 second, you will see a double quotation mark after it, like here, representing 30 seconds. It can also be changed on the live view screen if you have one. You'll see the numbers change on the top LCD screen, through the viewfinder, or on the screen itself. Now don't worry if that when you're trying to take a photograph, the camera either won't take one or you're getting a red flashing message on your aperture. All that means is that the lighting isn't suited to the shutter speed that you're trying to use. So just go ahead and change it and it should work fine after that. So that is all you need to know to get started. You can use more advanced techniques such as panning or zoom bursts, or you can go ahead and put your dial onto bulb mode and get those star trails with really long exposures. If you're interested in finding out more about how to do those, just let me know in the comments section below. Don't forget to check out my other videos on the exposure triangle, so the aperture and the ISO ones. And if you've enjoyed the video, give me a like, subscribe to my channel and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye!